The forest should not have been breathing. That was the first thing Reed noticed. Not the blood trail darkening the pine needles, not the strange luminescence seeping through the undergrowth like a dying star had taken root beneath the soil, but the sound. A low, rhythmic resonance, almost subsonic, vibrating somewhere behind his sternum where no external thing had any right to reach. He had spent 22 years in uniform learning to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he had was screaming that he was about to walk into something the world didn't have a name for yet. He followed the light anyway. Reed Calloway was 53 years old, retired from the 4th Special Operations Group, and currently living in a cabin outside Ashford, Oregon, for reasons he hadn't fully explained to anyone, including himself. The official story was that he needed quiet. The truer story involved a bridge in Kandahar, a decision made in 4 seconds that he'd been paying for over 12 years, and a recurring dream in which he always made the same choice again. He had come to this forest to stop thinking. The forest apparently had other plans. The light was coming from a hollow between two fallen Douglas firs, a natural alcove that smelled of cedar and something else, something crisp and electric, like the air before lightning, except warmer somehow, as if the electricity itself were alive and afraid. Reed crouched at the edge of the hollow and looked in. What he found there would take him years to fully describe, and even then, language would betray him at every turn. She was approximately human in outline, 2 arms, an upright torso, something like a face, but the similarities ended the way a river ends when it meets the ocean. Her skin shifted color in slow pulses, cycling from deep indigo through silver to a bruised, exhausted gray that made his chest tighten in a way he recognized from field medicine. The gray was wrong. He didn't know how he knew that, but he knew it the way you know a heartbeat is faltering before the monitor confirms it. Her legs were folded at angles that didn't match human anatomy, and her right side, from shoulder to hip, was dark with something thicker and slower than blood, a deep violet fluid that had soaked into the forest floor and was no longer flowing. She was watching him. Her eyes were solid amber, no visible iris or pupil, but the intelligence in them was unmistakable. So was the terror. And beneath the terror, held together with what looked like the last reserves of a very disciplined mind, was a kind of careful, calculating stillness. She was deciding whether to run. She was deciding whether she even could. Reed set down his rifle, slowly. Then he held up both hands. He didn't say anything yet. He'd learned a long time ago that words are the last thing a wounded creature needs to hear. She made a sound, not a word, something pre-verbal, a vibration that raised the hair on his arms and somehow communicated with absolute clarity that she wanted him to stay back. He nodded once, stayed where he was, let her look at him long enough to understand that he wasn't moving, wasn't reaching for anything, wasn't calculating angles the way men who meant harm always eventually did. Her color shifted. The deep, panicked indigo bled back towards silver at the edges, just slightly. That was enough. Reed had operated in 6 countries across 3 continents. He had extracted wounded soldiers from positions that made survival mathematically impossible. He had carried men who outweighed him by 40 pounds through 2 miles of hostile terrain, with nothing but stubbornness and the specific kind of love that forms in combat, the kind that doesn't have a civilian equivalent. He had never in his life encountered a situation for which he was less technically prepared and more instinctively equipped. He reached into his pack, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone diffusing something. He pulled out an emergency thermal blanket, a field dressing kit, and a bottle of water. He set all 3 on the ground between them and then sat back, cross-legged in the pine needles, and waited. She stared at the items for a long time. Then she reached for the water. Her hand, 4 fingers, joints in unexpected places, the skin still cycling through those slow color pulses, wrapped around the bottle with a grip that suggested she'd never held one before. She turned it in the fading afternoon light, studying it with the focused, reverent attention of someone handling an artifact from a civilization they'd only read about, which, Reed would later understand, was almost exactly what she was doing. She pressed it against her wounded side, a cooling measure, he realized, not hydration. Her kind didn't drink water the same way. She didn't know what it was for, but she understood cold, and right now her body was running a fever that his thermal imaging would later confirm had been dangerously close to catastrophic. He wanted to reach out and stop her, to explain, to show her how to open it. He stayed still instead, let her figure it out, let her maintain whatever dignity she had left. That was the first kindness. He would not understand until much later how completely it undid her. She told him her name in the 4th hour. Or rather, she produced a sequence of sounds, 2 long, resonant tones with a sharp click between them, and then watched his face with the patient exhaustion of someone who expected to be misunderstood. He repeated it back as faithfully as he could. She flinched at his pronunciation, then stilled, then did something he didn't expect. The skin across her cheekbones lit up in a brief, warm, amber flash that matched her eyes. He would later learn that this was the Dravali equivalent of a reluctant smile. Zahari, she said, with more care this time, slowing the syllables. Ze-a-ri. Read, he answered. She repeated it immediately, perfectly, with an accent that made it sound like a word in a very old and serious language. He felt absurdly honored. Over the next hour, using gestures and the strange, exhausting telepathy of two people trying desperately to communicate across an abyss, he understood the following. She was injured badly. She had been here for 2 days. She was alone. Whatever had happened to her, she had not expected to survive it, and she was still not certain she would. He got the field dressing out again. This time he held it up, pointed to her wound, and waited. She looked at the dressing, looked at him. The indigo deepened. He thought she was going to refuse. Instead, she held out her arm, not the wounded side, but the other arm, the one that was uninjured, as if offering a different target, as if saying, "Take this instead, spare the rest." He realized, with a careful ache, that she thought the medical treatment might be for him, that he might need something from her in exchange for his presence, that the kindness must come with a price, because in her experience, it always had. He shook his head gently, pointed again to the wound, placed his hand briefly on his own chest over his heart, said nothing. She was very still for a very long time. Then she shifted the violet-stained fabric, something that functioned like a tunic, made of material that seemed to absorb and redirect light rather than reflect it, and let him see the wound. It was bad. He'd seen worse, technically, but never on something he couldn't fully categorize, which meant he had to improvise everything and trust his hands and his training, and the fact that biology, at its most basic level, tends to want the same thing everywhere: to close, to seal, to survive. He worked quickly and carefully, talking in low, steady sentences, not because she could understand him, but because silence during field medicine creates its own kind of terror. He narrated what he was doing. He warned her before he touched her. He apologized when he had to press harder. She made no sound throughout, holding herself with a discipline that hurt to witness, her color cycling in long, slow waves between silver and gray. When he finished, she looked at the dressing, touched it with 2 fingers, very lightly, then she passed out. He caught her before she hit the ground. Something shifted in the forest that night. Not dramatically, there was no supernatural revelation, no voice from the sky, just the quiet weight of another person's unconscious breathing in the dark, and the specific, ancient responsibility that comes with being the only one awake. Reed built a small fire, not for warmth. The Oregon night was cool but not threatening, but because fire means someone is there, someone is watching, and there is something in that meaning that crosses every biological and cultural barrier he could think of. He placed his thermal blanket over her carefully, noting the way her color stabilized slightly in the warmth, drifting toward silver rather than gray. He did not sleep. Around 3 in the morning, he pulled out his phone and stared at the search bar for a long time. He thought about who he would call. He thought about what would happen if he did. He thought about men in unmarked vehicles and secure facilities with too many cameras, and the way governments tend to treat the things they don't understand, not with wonder, but with caution that calcifies into something worse. He put the phone away. He would ask her when she woke what she wanted him to do. That seemed important. That seemed actually like the only thing that mattered. She woke at dawn. She came back to consciousness the way a tide comes in, gradually, then all at once, and the first thing she did was locate him. Her amber eyes found him across the small fire with an intensity that felt less like fear and more like recalibration, like she was updating some internal model that hadn't previously included the category of human who keeps watch over strangers in the dark and asks for nothing. She said something in her own language, long, complex, the consonants hard and the vowels resonant in a way that made the fire seem brighter. He waited. She tried again, slower, separated the sounds, used her hands in a way that wasn't signing exactly but was close enough that he could follow the general shape of the meaning. "Why didn't you leave?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you were hurt," he said finally, "and I wasn't." She processed this for a long time. "That is not how it works," she said, in syllables so deliberate they were barely speech, cobbled together from the sounds she had heard him use through the night while he'd been narrating his field medicine routine, matched to meanings she had inferred with a cognitive speed that stunned him once he fully understood it. He thought she meant, "That's not how humans work." He would realize later that she meant, "That's not how anything works. Not in her experience, not in her world." Her name was Zahari, and she was a Dravali cartographer, a role that apparently combined elements of scientist, diplomat, and soldier, because Dravali territory maps were not merely geographic but political, and making them was dangerous enough to require combat training and the specific psychological profile of someone who could be alone in hostile space for months without losing the ability to be careful. She told him this in fragments over the morning, her grasp of English expanding with a speed that should have been unsettling, but instead felt like watching something bloom. She had been shot down, not by humans, by her own people's enemies, a faction whose name she gave him in her own language, and which he could not repeat, but which she accompanied with a darkening of her skin that told him everything about what they represented to her. Her ship was in pieces somewhere over the Pacific. She had survived the landing because Dravali survival suits were over-engineered in the specific way that things built by people who have made too many mistakes become over-engineered. She had walked into the forest because forests are the same everywhere, she said, which he found achingly beautiful. She had not called for rescue. He asked why. She was quiet. Then she said, "There is a protocol for capture situations, for situations where you are wounded and alone, and the rescue signal might bring others instead of your own people. The protocol is to wait, to survive without contact, for 72 hours. And then you send the signal and hope. When did the 72 hours start? When I landed, 2 days before you found me." He did the math. "You had 2 hours left." "Yes." "You were going to make it," he said. She looked at him with those unreadable amber eyes, and he understood that she had not, actually, believed that. She had been waiting to die with enough composure that whoever found her afterward would know she hadn't been afraid. That was when he understood the guardedness, the precise calibration of her trust, the way she had offered her uninjured arm in place of her wound, because in her world, the cost of help is always extracted from somewhere you can afford less to give. She had grown up, she told him later, in a system where the Dravali were the minority, in terms of both numbers and power, on Keth Prime, and where the majority species had spent 3 generations deciding whether Dravali cognitive abilities made them assets or threats. Her parents had been scientists, brilliant people who had been careful their entire lives, who had taught her that survival required intelligence and distance and the patience to never let anyone see what you actually needed. She had been 6 years old when she understood that care was conditional. She had been 12 when she decided it was safer to stop needing it. She was, she said, approximately the Dravali equivalent of 38 years old. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. He made coffee on the camp stove he'd retrieved from the cabin, a 20-minute round trip that he'd undertaken while she slept again in the morning, leaving his rifle within her reach, which she had noted when she woke and not mentioned, but which had done something visible to her color, warming it toward gold. He handed her a cup. She looked at it with the same careful attention she'd given the water bottle, and this time he showed her how to hold it. She wrapped both hands around the mug, four-fingered grip, joints bending in those unexpected directions, and sat with the steam rising between them. She sipped it, paused, made a sound that he was fairly certain was the Dravali version of "What in the world is this?" "Coffee," he said. "Coffee." She said it like a prayer in a language she was still learning to believe in. If you're finding this story working its way into something real in you, that's what this channel does. Subscribe and stay with us. There are many more of these waiting. She sent the signal at noon. He knew, when she pulled the device from somewhere inside her tunic, a small flat thing that pulsed with that same subsonic resonance he'd felt at the start, that the window they'd had was closing. He felt it in his chest before he thought it in his head, which was unusual for him. He'd spent a long time training feeling to follow thought. She had reversed the order in less than 18 hours. "They will come quickly," she said. "I know. You could leave, before they arrive. It would be safer for you." He considered this. He was not by nature someone who left before the job was done, but he also understood that his presence at the extraction point might complicate things in ways that would be bad for her and not just for him. He looked at her, trying to read those amber eyes, and found that he could now, slightly, just slightly. The warmth had returned to them, that gold undertone that meant something he didn't have a word for yet. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. "I want you to stay," she said finally, with the precise precision of someone stating something true that they had not intended to admit. "The protocol says you should go. I want you to stay." He stayed. 3 ships descended through the cloud cover 2 hours later, moving with a silence that was more unsettling than noise would have been. They were beautiful, he had to admit. Organic in shape, the hulls carrying that same light-absorbing quality as Zahari's tunic, as if they'd been grown rather than built. They landed in the meadow at the forest's edge, and figures emerged, taller than Zahari, wearing something that functioned like armor, their skin colors locked into a steady, tactical blue-green that told him, now that he'd learned to read the language, that they were cautious and armed and ready to be afraid. They saw him and went very still. One of them said something sharp, and he felt every weapon on those figures orient toward him with the coordinated precision of people who had practiced this. Zahari stepped in front of him. She spoke in her own language, quickly and with a force that surprised him. Not loud, but weighted, each word landing with the kind of authority that comes from rank and from certainty and from the particular fury of someone protecting something they have decided matters. The figures listened. Their colors shifted. The weapons did not lower, but they did not fire either. She turned back to him. They want to know what you want in return, she said. For the help. They want to know the cost. Tell them there isn't one, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said it, not translating his words, but saying something of her own, something longer and more complex, and whatever it was, it made the figure's colors shift in a wave, cycling from tactical blue-green through something warmer, something he hadn't seen yet. He would ask her later what she had said. She thought about it for a while. Then she said, I told them he did not make me prove I was worth helping first. I told them that was the only cost, that you paid it instead of charging it. The weapons lowered. He thought about the bridge in Kandahar. He thought about the decision made in 4 seconds and 12 years of dreaming about it since. He thought about the particular shape of the guilt he'd been carrying, which was not that he'd made the wrong choice, but that the right choice had cost someone else everything, while it had only cost him sleep. He looked at Zahari, standing between him and danger with a wound in her side and a mug of cold coffee somewhere back in the hollow. And he thought that maybe the forest had known what it was doing when it brought him here. That maybe, and this was a thought he held carefully, the way you hold something you're not yet sure is real, there were different kinds of bridges, and some of them you didn't blow. Some of them you walked. She had to leave. She stood at the edge of the meadow and the edge of whatever came next, and she faced him with that careful, recalibrated attention that now felt less like threat assessment and more like the way people look at things they are trying to memorize. The protocol, she said, does not cover this. No, he agreed. My people will want to study what happened here, what you did. They will not understand it quickly. That's okay, he said. I've been not understanding things for a while. You get used to it. Her skin flared gold, full and warm and unguarded, the most color he'd seen from her. And he understood now that this was not a smile, exactly. It was something bigger than a smile. It was the Dravali expression for encountering something that changes the size of what you thought was possible. She reached out and placed her four-fingered hand briefly, deliberately, against his chest, over his heart, the way he had done, the first night, when words weren't enough and he needed her to understand that his intentions lived there rather than in anything he could prove. He put his hand over hers, just for a moment. Coffee, she said softly, like a promise, like a word from a new language she'd decided to keep learning. Then she turned and walked into the light, and the ships rose without sound, and the forest fell back into its ordinary breathing, the kind that didn't vibrate behind your sternum, the kind that didn't ask anything of you. Reed stood in the meadow for a long time after. He picked up the thermal blanket on his way back through the hollow. The violet stain was already darkening into the pine needles, becoming part of the soil, becoming ordinary. He folded the blanket carefully and put it in his pack. He collected the coffee mug. He walked back to the cabin as the sun went low and orange and the shadows of the trees reached across the path like hands. He didn't know if she would come back. He didn't know if he would ever have a word for what those hours had been. He didn't know if the world would get bigger or smaller now that he was aware of everything it contained. But somewhere between the bridge in Kandahar and a hollow in an Oregon forest, something had quietly closed. Not healed. He was old enough to know the difference, but closed. Oriented towards something. Pointed, finally, in a direction that had light at the end of it. He made a second cup of coffee when he got home. He held it with both hands in the cooling dark of the kitchen, and he let himself, for the first time in 12 years, sit still without waiting for the dream. Some encounters don't ask permission before they change you. Some connections form in the exact places where both parties had given up expecting them. And sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the universe is simply this: a person who does not make you prove you're worth helping first, who sets down what could hurt you and stays, who asks what you need, and then waits long enough to hear the real answer. The forest had been breathing. Now, finally, so was he. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. It genuinely means a lot. If this story reached you, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Stories like this one come out regularly, and each of them is made with the same care you felt right here. See you in the next one.